and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristin. Today we're not stepping into a churchyard or colonial burying ground, but walking the forgotten field of Danvers State Hospital Cemetery, located in Danvers, Massachusetts. Here beneath numbered stones and tangled weeds lie the voiceless dead of an asylum that once was called the Palace on the Hill. Their names erased, their stories locked away, their graves forgotten. The aroma of coffee mingles in the air. The gates stand open. Step carefully. It's time to descend into the hauntings of history. It's finally October, the season of bone deep chills, whispered legends, and crisp nights by the bonfire. Halloween is just around the corner, and New England becomes a stage for all things haunted. Tourists flock to Salem, drawn by witch trial lore, colonial gravestones, and the crackle of leaves underfoot. But not far from those bustling streets lies a forgotten chapter, one that rarely makes it onto the ghost tours. Just a short drive away atop a wooded hill in Danvers, rose an imposing structure once known as the State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers. Built with the promise of healing, Danvers State Hospital instead became a monument to broken minds and silent suffering. Though it was later added to the National Register of Historic Places, even that honor could not preserve it. In 2006, most of the buildings were torn down. What remained was soon consumed by a fire, an inferno so vast it lit the sky and was seen from Boston, 17 miles away. From the ashes, luxury apartments rose, standing on the scars of the vanished asylum. Yet not all was erased. Fragments of brickwork still loom, quiet, brooding reminders of what stood before. And hidden beyond chain link fences and creeping overgrowth lies the hospital cemetery, sunken, silent, and untouched. What people find horrifying about asylums has always fascinated me because originally they were meant to be anything but. They were designed to be bright, airy, and restorative places, healing environments, even a palace for the mind. But that palace quickly turned grim. Danvers State Hospital opened in 1878, and in its early years it held just under 600 patients. But that number swelled rapidly, far beyond what the structure or staff could support. One of the darkest truths about these institutions was that not everyone inside was mentally ill. Many were simply misunderstood, inconvenient, or cast aside. In those early days, being outspoken or even experiencing something as common as PMS, known as hysteria at the time, could earn you a bed behind locked doors. Families, overwhelmed or ashamed, signed their relatives over for what they called moral treatment. What was meant to be a place of recovery quickly became a place of exile. Most people journey to Salem for the witch trial lore and its ghosts, but the grounds at Danvers State Hospital hold a darker legacy. In 1878, the asylum rose on Hathorne Hill, land once tied to the family of Judge John Hathorne, whose name is forever stained by the trials. Salem Village, as Danvers was once called, was home to not only the accused, but to the accusers and the judges. Hawthorne was remembered for his ruthless interrogations and presumption of guilt. He left behind a legacy that many believe cursed the very soil on this hill, and it's not hard to see why. Though the hospital itself is gone, the hill remains, its earth layered with judgment, suffering, and silence. To this day, some wonder if the hospital was doomed from the very beginning, its foundations laid on ground already tainted by shame and cruelty. At the cost of 1.5 million, the asylum rose as a sprawling complex. Two grand central blocks for the administration, the radiating wings and flurrying like skeletal arms. Behind them stood the kitchen, laundry, chapel, and dormitories for attendants, while Middleton Pond fed water into the institution's veins. On one side dwelled the men, the other the women, leaving the outermost wards reserved for those deemed most violent and the most hopeless. Over time, new buildings sprouted around the original Kirkbride plan, transforming the grounds itself into a city. A gymnasium and auditorium rose where old kitchens stood once, and sunlight solaria were grafted onto the wards, their brightness belying the shadows within. Beneath it, though, ran a labyrinth of tunnels, arteries connecting the hospital to its power plant, nurses' homes, medical buildings, and machine shops. In the dead of winter, the complex could function almost as its own underground world. The Kirkbride's design envisioned 500 patients with attic space for perhaps 1,000 more. By the 1930s and 40s, though, over 2,000 souls were crammed inside. Even the basements became holding cells. Overcrowding twisted the hospital into a prison where patients lived in squalor and neglect. And if that wasn't grim enough, what followed was far worse: the age of experimentation. Danvers was never merely a place of recovery or confinement. It was an institution grasping for a cure, and in that pursuit, it became infamous as the birthplace for the lobotomy. Alongside the crude severings of minds came insulin shock therapy, electroconvulsive treatment, physical restraints, and endless hours of isolation. The words grew heavy with whispers of abuse, neglect, and horror. Yet, despite its reputation, families continued to send their loved ones through its doors. Whether driven by fear, stigma, or convenience, they kept coming, handing them over to the shadows of Danvers. Though the asylum was founded to provide residential treatment for the mentally ill, its role soon expanded. In 1889, it launched a formal nursing program, and by 1895, a pathological research laboratory was in operation. Superintendent Dr. Charles Page, who oversaw the hospital in the 1890s, even declared that the mechanical restraints were both unnecessary and harmful to those suffering from mental illness. By the 1920s, the institution had stretched its reach further, operating school clinics to evaluate children for signs of mental deficiency. Yet behind this veneer of progress, darker practices unfolded. Reports surfaced of shock therapies, lobotomies, heavy drugs, and straitjackets used not as treatment, but as tools of control within the overcrowded wards. Controversies followed, but the machinery of the asylum pressed on. By the 1960s, the tide began to turn. New emphasis on alternative therapies, deinstitutionalization, and community based mental health care reduced the patient population. At the same time, sweeping budget cuts gutted the hospital's ability to function. Wards began to shutter in 1969, and by 1985, most of the original Kirkbride stood silent and abandoned. The administration block itself closed in 1989, with patients shifted to the smaller Bonner Medical Building. Finally, on June 24th, 1992, the gates closed for good. The last remaining patients were transferred, some to other institutions, others released into the community, leaving behind an empty shell. The once proud hospital, born from the visions of moral treatment, was left to decay, its silence haunted by the echoes of all who had been confined within. The cemetery lies tucked away on the former hospital grounds, hidden in the woods behind what remains of the buildings. A gravel road leads to a narrow path opening to a quiet field of the forgotten. Like many institutions of its time, Danvers had its own burial ground, set apart, silent, and rarely visited. Here rests nearly 800 souls, most once marked by only numbers instead of names. For decades, rows of identical markers bore nothing but anonymity, each one a stark reminder of how patients were abandoned not only in life, but in death. Families seldom came to claim their dead at institutions like Danvers, causing silence to settle over the field, graves left unrecognized, and names erased. Only in recent years have memorial stones begun to rise, fragile attempts to restore identity to the lost. Yet still, rows of numbered markers remain, mute witnesses to abandonment, to neglect, to the uneasy border between memory and oblivion. It's the Danvers State Memorial Committee that's labored to pierce this darkness. In dust choked archives and brittle ledgers, they search for the truth, matching names to numbers, the forgotten to their graves. Through their work, fragments of identity have been carved back into stone, whispering the lost back into history. These were lives smothered by stigma, laid to rest in silence, and their suffering shrouded beneath the heavy veil of shame. Even in the grave, the ghost of Danvers stretched beyond that veil, their stories pressing against the living. For the moment the hospital doors swung open in 1878, whispers of unease seeped into its halls. At first, there were the mutterings of patients, shadows glimpsed in the corridors, voices rising from the rooms that should have been empty. But as the decades passed, as the buildings decayed beneath the overcrowding and the suffering, the whispers became louder. They transformed into screams in the night, sobbing that rippled down hallways, and footsteps echoing through corridors long after they had emptied. When Danvers closed its doors in 1992, one might think the voices would finally fall silent. Instead, they seemed to grow stronger. In the years of abandonment that followed, trespassers and urban explorers returned with their own accounts. They spoke of slamming doors, of moans that rose from the walls themselves, and that particular dread, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Many who entered came out pale, shaken, unable to explain why the air itself seemed to press down on them, thick with sorrow and accusation. The catalog of ghostly phenomenon attributed to Danvers is long and chilling. Disembodied voices, sometimes screaming, sometimes whispering. Those are the most common. Others describe phantoms sobbing, the sound of patients crying in rooms left empty for decades. Doors are said to slam shut with a violent force, often in the absence of wind or touch. In stairwells, investigators have reported the steady tread of footsteps rising behind them, only to turn and find the stairs deserted. Shadowy figures haunt nearly every retelling. These are not merely glimpses. Witnesses describe full silhouettes looming in doorways, darting from one end of the hallway to the other, vanishing though when approached. In photographs, strange forms seem to appear, darker than shadow, blotting the air. Even seasoned investigators have admitted they fled the tunnels after seeing movement flickering at the edges of their vision, as though someone or something kept pace with them in the dark. Electronic voice phenomenon, or known as EVP, has only deepened the mystery. Paranormal groups who brought recorders into the asylum when it was around captured faint but chilling words, answers to questions spoken aloud, whispers tangled in static, sometimes even a single word, help, sometimes a full phrase, too clear to be dismissed as interference. Many of these recordings came from the tunnels and the hospital cemetery, as if the spirits clung most tightly to those hidden, forgotten places. Danvers is not haunted simply because it's old. Its spectral reputation is born of the immense suffering it contained. At its peak, over 2,000 patients were crammed into a building designed for half that number. The overcrowding was staggering. Patients lived in filth, locked into wards where disease, neglect, and despair spread unchecked. Treatments too carved torment into its walls. The weight of that suffering settled into the bones of the hospital. Its Kirkbride design, vast, sprawling, intended as a place for recovery, instead became a prison of anguish. Stone and iron absorbed it all until the very air seemed charged with memory. To walk through Danvers, many claimed, was to feel the residue of despair pressing against your skin, as though the building itself carried the cries of those it had failed. Certain places on the grounds became notorious among ghost hunters and locals alike. The administration block with its looming clock tower was one such site. Faces had been spotted in its windows, even long after the wards were gutted. Visitors reported cold spots, sudden drops in temperature, and the sound of faint typing, as though the clerks still sat at their desks cataloging patients who never left. Beneath the surface lies the tunnels, long, narrow corridors that once allowed staff to move unseen between the wings. These tunnels are steeped in legend. Paranormal investigators describe the sensation of being followed, of whispers brushing against their ears in the dark. Some refuse to enter at all, claiming the atmosphere shifts the moment one steps below ground, heavy and oppressive, as though the tunnels themselves breathe. The cemetery bears its own weight of silence. Visitors tell of whispers that weave through the trees, of faint lights drifting like souls unmoored, of the sorrow that clings to the air like mist. Even as memorials have returned names to stone, anonymity lingers, as though the earth itself resists forgetting. It's here in this uneasy silence that the stories of hauntings linger for Danvers today. The legend of Danvers did not remain confined to its grounds. Its specters seeped outward into literary and film. H.P. Lovecraft drew inspiration from Danvers when he created the Arkham Sanitarium, which in turn gave rise to the Arkham Asylum and the Batman mythos. The hospital's image shaped generations of fictional madhouses, cementing it as the archetype of horror itself. The film Session 9 in 2001 was shot within the abandoned asylum, capturing not only its physical decay, but the palpable dread that clung to its walls. In that film, the building was not just a setting, it was the antagonist. Countless novels, games, and tabletop scenarios have also drawn directly from Danvers, carrying its haunting aura into new mediums. The podcast Lore, a grim favorite, dedicated an entire episode echoes to its haunted history, proof that the hospital shadow still stretches across fiction, myth, and memory alike. What lingers at Danvers may not be the ghost in the traditional sense. It may be something deeper, more unsettling. The memory of suffering so profound it etched itself into a place. The asylum was a site of fear and of pain, and those who enter its grounds or its cemetery, even today, long after its demolition, often describe feeling that fear as if it were alive. Ghosts linger everywhere at Danvers, not as fleeting apparitions alone, but as a chorus of voices pressed into its walls. The hauntings are more than figures in windows or whispers in static. They're the shadows of those who lived, suffered, and died here. To walk the grounds is to feel them still, restless, unclaimed, and unwilling to be forgotten. Here at the Grim, we hope that even for a fleeting moment, the forgotten lives of the patients in Danvers are remembered by you, dear listeners. Beyond the horror lies the truth of lives hidden away upon these grounds, and for now, their stories once again slip back into stone, and maybe one day the dead will finally rest. Thank you for walking with us through the veil into Danvers State Hospital Cemetery, descending once more into the hauntings of history. The gate is sealed, the veil drawn, yet death keeps no calendar, and so we shall return, as we always do, on the Grim.